Thank you for joining us. This is Live with Miami's Community News, and I'm Michael Miller. We have two great guests here, David Pearson and his son, Chris Pearson. Thank you very much for being here. I've been a fan of yours for many, many years, and I don't know if you knew this, but years ago when we weren't quite working out, but we were on the treadmill over nearby, and we just would chat, and there was this camaraderie, this sense of belonging that you have with you. So I want to thank you for those years of whatever we talked about.
I remember him very well.
Yeah. So today is the 60th anniversary of a significant event. It was November 22nd, 1963. So why don't you tell us where you were and what happened on that day with you?
I was the Deputy Director of Information of the Peace Corps at that point, and I was sitting in my office at the Peace Corps building, which is across Lafayette Square from the White House. I was sitting in my office being interviewed by a reporter from Scripps Howard newspapers. And all of a sudden, we heard the teletype go ding, 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 5 bells. Well, you never get 5 bells. Never, no way. The last time there'd been 5 bells was at VJ Day. That's how important it was. So we knew it was something critically important. The secretary ran over and ripped off the sheet, and it said, "Kennedy shot, perhaps fatally." That was the headline on the teletype. So we were just stunned. We turned on the television right away so we could try to get some news. And all of a sudden the phone rang, and the secretary said, "It's for you." I picked up the phone and said, "Yes, it was Sergeant Shriver, Kennedy's brother-in-law."
So you're in the Peace Corps.
Yeah, I was.
Okay. Not working for the White House, but in the Peace Corps.
No, I was at the Peace Corps building, in the Peace Corps.
Okay.
And so Shriver called up and said, "Get your tail over here to the White House. I need your help right now." So I jumped up and ran downstairs to the elevator, ran across Lafayette Square, and got to the White House. And that's where Shriver and Bill Moyers and all the Kennedy guys were working, getting ready for the body to come.
What body was that?
That was President John F. Kennedy.
Yeah. So here you are, you're under the age of 40. How old were you then?
I was 30.
You're 30. You get this call, the president has been shot. Come over.
Right.
So you go over there, and I know you've heard the story many times, all right?
I still love it.
All right. And it is significant. So there you are at the White House. What is it like inside the White House at that point?
Well, the thing of it is, I had been in the White House several times before that. When just before I went with the Peace Corps, I was working for the White House as a special assistant. So I knew the East Room, I knew what that was, I knew the West Wing and so forth. So I got to the White House, and I asked one of the guards where Shriver was, and he said, "They were over in the West Wing." So I went over there, and there were all these people. The fact is that Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, was flying over the Pacific with some of the cabinet going to Japan. He was out of pocket. Matt Kilduff, the assistant, was with the president in Dallas. So there was no press secretary there, nobody to handle the press. Well, obviously the press was just, trying to get in there left and right. So Shriver said to me, "You have to handle the press. You have to take care of that." So I said, "Okay." So I went out to the press room. There must have been 100 gathered in there. And I said, press secretaries are not here, guys. We're going to get the information. Everything that happens, we'll get it right out to you. So then I went back to the West Room, and I just listened, and then I took notes on everything that was planned by those guys, by Shriver and the other people, for the weekend, for the funeral and for the march and all that.
Okay, we're going to skip over to some really important things that happened when we're going to get back to that. I'd like to go ahead and put an image up now. I was thinking that we could put it up of the inside the White House. So can we get that one that shows inside the White House? And this might be a good time to read excerpts from your book, JFK and Bobby, Arnie, and Jack. And David.
Right.
And David. This David.
Right. That book is available at Books and Books. By the way, there's a commercial.
All right. So we have it. So I think that this is the one, right? Yes. So why don't you? We're going to go ahead and Chris is going to read parts of the book as it directly relate to David and what was occurring here. You were in the room at this time.
That is the East Room. That is the body, and the catafalque that casket is on was the same catafalque as Lincoln's body was on. They brought it over from the archives department and brought it into the East Room.
Okay, Chris, we're ready for you.
Now, in the blackest part of the night, just before dawn, headlights begin to cut through the gloom in front of the White House. Most of us, embarrassed and feeling out of place, retreat to a corner of the East Room. Shriver remains at the door to greet the widow and direct the pallbearers. I hear the routine sound of doors opening and closing, low voices. Then come sounds that make me shiver. A military voice snaps a "Halt!" command, and there is the clipped staccato sound of boots hitting the hard floors. We've been in this hushed and calm house for hours, and now I hear marching. The Norman Rockwell Marines carry in the body and set it down on the replica of Lincoln's catafalque. The young priest and 2 altar boys kneel and pray silently. The pallbearers step back from the casket. Now I look over at Jacqueline Kennedy, and it seems to me that she appeared out of nowhere, an apparition, standing in that characteristic pose of hers that would become so well known to the world in the ensuing days. Feet apart, the slight lean forward, stiff and awestruck. Her lips are parted slightly. Her eyes are as if she had just been surprised, only they stay that way, a wrinkle of disbelief on her brow. I look at her suit. I remember what Kilduff has said, and am surprised that she hasn't changed clothes. The dark stains are all over her skirt and her stockings. I know it doesn't matter that she hasn't changed her clothes, but the idea gnaws at me, and it is one of the totally irrelevant thoughts that plague us all through the night. The priest moves back. He nods to Mrs. Kennedy. She takes the 5 steps to the casket and quickly kneels down, almost falling, on the edge of the catafalque. Her hands hang loosely at her sides. She lays her forehead against the side of the casket. She kneels there like that for what seems like a long time, but it must span no more than 2 or 3 minutes. There is dead silence, absolutely no sound of any kind. The only movement is the dancing of the 4 yellow flames. The soldiers are statues. The rest of us, motionless, blend in to the darkness as if not there. I'm almost afraid to breathe. With her forehead tilted onto the casket, the widow seems like a teenage girl, head against the flank of her horse or something equally dear and equally mute. She picks up the edge of the flag and kisses it. Slowly, she starts to rise. Then, without any warning, Mrs. Kennedy begins crying. Her slender frame is rocked by sobs, and she slumps back down. Her knees give way. Bobby Kennedy moves up quickly, puts one arm around her waist. He stands there with her for a moment and just lets her cry. It's a perfectly natural thing for a person to do. It would only be later, when the world is to perceive her as a regal and strong woman, and almost inhumanly stoic, that I will relive this scene. Here by her husband's casket, she is most human. She is grieving. She is wretched. Through the coming days, many people would actually wonder whether she could have loved him very much, because she didn't seem to mourn the way people mourn who love deeply. But those of us in the East Room tonight know she did. Bobby moves her away from the casket. She is led upstairs. They have brought John Kennedy home.
Wow, David, significant. You're still moved by it.
Yes, yes, yes. I just, it's almost as if it happened last night. That's incredible. 60 years ago.
You were so descriptive in there. I mean, we are right there grieving with not just the Kennedy family, but for the people that are in the room and a nation.
Well, 2 things. One, I'm a writer. I was a writer. I started out in the Herald building here in Miami with United Press International. So I'm a writer. Number two, I took notes on everything. I kept writing little notes, and I kept all the papers in a box. And it wasn't until 2 or 3 years later that I had the ability, the prescience, to be able to write that story from those notes that I had.
So that was in 1967?
Yeah.
You wrote that in 67,
Yeah.
63.
Right.
When it said it took a few years to do it, why did it take you a few years to do it?
The shock took, I was in a state of shock, really. I just didn't, it didn't seem real. It didn't ever seem real to me.
It seems to me right now, as I look at you, you're almost in the room.
I know.
It's just an incredible impact that it had on you and subsequently on Chris and the people in your family. So,
Yes.
so here you are, age 30,
Yep.
through something that has rarely ever happened. All right, all this stuff is thrusted upon you, this gigantic responsibility of helping in that.
Right.
So took a couple of years then before you say, okay, let me try to sort that out. When you wrote that, what was it like when sitting at your typewriter? It was an electric typewriter or a computer, right?
It was an Olympia.
Right. Way to go. We have a few in the back. So what's that like when you're writing it? I mean, how do you connect that spirit from in here and here in your hands and then translate it into words and on that? What was that like for you?
First of all, I had to be in the office by myself. I went into my office and told my secretary to leave me alone. Nobody, I didn't want anybody to come in. And I spent hours at a time, 2 or 3 hours at a time, writing globs of copy. And it was like I was back there standing in the corner watching all this happening. And I wrote it first person. I wrote it first person because I felt that I had to say, and I also wrote it first person, I don't know if you noticed, present tense, so that it would seem as if you, the reader, were right there with me.
I was. When Chris just did it now, all right? People are going to be there. And so you wrote that 60 minus 4, 56 years ago. Did you ever think back then that might live on for so long? What did you think was going to happen with this stuff? And that here we would be all that years later doing that and living through that again.
For a year or two, again, as I say, the shock was just so great that I didn't really think about it per se. But then after a couple of years, I started thinking about the future. And that's when I wrote that. I knew I had to write that story before I forgot it.
Yeah. And Chris, you were probably born around that time?
I was.
So when did you start to become acutely aware of what your father participated and saw and felt?
5 or 6 years old, because he had some framed photographs of himself with Sergeant Shriver and with President Johnson.
Can we put those pictures
after
up
the
now?
assassination.
Oh, hold on one second. Can we put those pictures up now? And is it possible to keep us in the frame? If we can, it's all right, but maybe Lorenzo can help. So this is a picture of the casket.
That's the
Right.
casket.
And who's this?
That's Sergeant Shriver, who was the President Kennedy's brother-in-law and David's mentor and boss. And
He supervised Jackie called him up on the phone and said, Sarge, I'd like you to take care of all the arrangements, please. I'd like to have him buried first.
They were calling you.
No, Jackie called Sarge.
Okay, got it. Okay.
She said, I'd like him to be buried first as a Catholic, secondly as a naval officer, third as a Kennedy, and fourth as president. And so he kept that in mind as he directed all the events for the weekend.
Your memory of this is so good. I know you've only been over about like 20,000 times,
Yeah.
but it's working. All right,
Yeah.
let's see another picture.
Yeah.
What else do we have? Okay. So who took these pictures? Do you remember?
I don't remember that.
Okay, so tell us again who these are.
That's Bobby Kennedy
Yep.
on the left, the Attorney General, Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow, in the center, and of course, Senator Ted Kennedy on the right.
So this is the day of the funeral, I assume.
This is a funeral march.
Freedom March. Okay, let's see the next video, the next shot. So I know you're in there, Dave, somewhere.
That's a picture of me shaking hands with President Johnson, with Sergeant Shriver's. If you see him over the president's right shoulder in the back behind the president, introducing me to the president. That was in the Rose Garden, and all those people, those young people in the picture, are returned Peace Corps volunteers. That was the first group of volunteers who had come back from South America, where they'd been for 2 years.
So this is a couple days after the assassination.
Right, a couple of days after the assassination.
Shriver, wasn't he the one that helped create and Kennedy create the Peace Corps?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
And when someone asked him why he did it, he said, well, nobody thought the Peace Corps would be a success, and so the president said, Sarge, you take care of it in case it fails.
Yeah, another job. All right. Do we have any other pictures?
This letter was framed in our hallway, and it's a letter from Sergeant Shriver to my father thanking him, and the date is just a few days after the assassination, thanking him for coming to the White House the night of the 22nd and saying that we couldn't have gotten things ready in time if it weren't for people like you.
That's the kind of guy he was, that
Right.
he would actually think to sit down and dictate a letter like that 3 or 4 days after that thing.
Okay. Do we have any other pictures? Is that it? Oh, I think that was it. Was that it, Rochelle? Okay. So, all right, let's go back to the camera. So here you are. You're a young man. The funeral's over. The world, or at least the United States, is mourning. Certainly you were in a state of mourning and of shock. So a couple of years later, you say, okay, it's time to reorganize myself. And so what did you start doing, and how did the impact of that, of the assassination and you participated in it, change, if all, the direction of your life?
Wow. It definitely did. First of all, I was very close to Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers had been deputy director of the Peace Corps under Shriver, and I worked directly for him. So when this happened, I met with him, and we talked about what we were going to do. And he said, I'm going with Lyndon. Well, he was a protege of Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson from Texas. So he went over to the White House with Lyndon. And so I stayed there, the Peace Corps, and for a year. And during that time, Johnson came in, and you may remember that he got a lot of legislation passed that Kennedy couldn't get passed, including the Civil Rights Act, which Kennedy could not get through Congress. Johnson got it through. Johnson took advantage of this collective national guilt that everybody had about not doing enough for Kennedy. And he took that and he ran with it, and he got that Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act created a whole lot of different...
What year was that? Do you remember what year?
1964.
That fast.
64, the next year.
Yeah, he knew the timing was right.
Yes, exactly. So 1964, so he called on former Florida Governor Leroy Collins, who was then president of the National Association of Broadcasters. Very big job.
Yep.
He called him over to the White House and said, Roy, I want you to help me. I need you to help me with civil rights, because he knew that Leroy Collins was a progressive Southern governor,
Yep.
a progressive governor, that he wasn't a segregationist. So he called on Collins and made him head of what was the government civil rights program. Collins was looking for people in the government to help him.
Was that
And
you?
he had met me a few months before, and he remembered that. He called me up and said, Dave, I need you to come over here and help me with the civil rights thing.
So what was that like for you when you said, wow, right?
Yeah, I was really floored. I didn't even think he remembered me. And I went to Shriver and said, Sarge, I've got to go over to work in civil rights. And he said, Dave, I thought you were going to go stay here with me and go to the poverty program with me. Because Johnson had asked Shriver to take over the war on poverty.
I hate to interrupt you, but at that point, already ingrained in you was to help people. So you're working with the poor people. Now you're working with people that historically were suppressed and oppressed that needed help.
Right.
So was there any thinking, well, should I do it or not? Or was it like, I'm doing this because it can help, we can help people and that you knew you could do
The
it?
idea of not saying yes to Leroy Collins, Lyndon Johnson, Bill Moyers, the idea of saying no, it was inconceivable.
So your dad was very progressive then, and now you look, well, of course. But back then it was not of course. Because my dad took me to St. Augustine when the whites wanted to beat up the blacks and took us right there to the streets. And I remember, the whites were on the sidewalk and the highway state patrol was there and the blacks.
It was bad,
Right? And I remember saying, what did those people do to these blacks, to these people, that they would be like that? So some people knew that in their hearts. So you did, right? So I know that you passed that down to your son because I'm looking at him, right? And I can see it in his eyes. Where did it come from you? When did you know this is what I want to do with the Peace Corps? There was something that was there that caused you to initially do that.
Well, I have to say, go back. It came from my mother and father. My father, the Pearsons all came from South Georgia. They all came down to Miami in the boom years in the 1920s. Daddy came down with a family in 1934. I moved to Miami in 1934. He was the first anesthesiologist at Jackson Hospital in Miami. My father, Dr. Colquitt Pearson. My mother.
Your grandfather?
Correct.
Yes, my mother was a saint. She was one of those people who just spent her whole life helping other people. Through the church and through the warriors. She was head of the Red Cross in Miami.
So you came from a family of people that are giving and
my whole family was about doing things for other people. So when Kennedy made that speech, the inaugural speech, my wife and I were sitting in our living room, and he said, ask not what you can do, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It hit me. I knew we had to do something. And it was just a matter of days before someone called from Washington and asked me to come up there. So.
That's an amazing process. So Chris, you were about 5 years old. You started seeing these frames in your house. When did it dawn on you in a really big way? Wow, something significant happened and my family was involved in that.
Oh, I was in grade school, and we were talking about President Kennedy and the assassination, and I suddenly put things together that my father had been involved in that whole night, that whole evening of that tragic night, and started asking him questions about it, and he started telling us, to me and my sisters.
You're at Sunset Elementary, right?
Right.
We were just kids then.
Yep.
So you managed to pass it from your folks and now through you. And we recognize that is vitally important so that tomorrow's a better place. Your life has been pretty fulfilling, I gather, at this point.
Oh yeah, that really changed my life, because a year working in civil rights for Leroy Collins, during that time, lots of terrible things happened.
What years was that?
1964 and 5. And during that time, that was the March on Selma, which Collins was in. And so I worked with people like Julian Bond and John Lewis, people like that. I got to meet them. So I realized at a certain point that it was time to leave, time to get out of the government, and time to go out and make a living. You know, like a real person. So I came back to Miami which is, as you know, is my home, and started a PR firm. In fact, it was right next door to the bank on Sunset, next to the First National Bank of South Miami, in that little building there.
What year was that, more or less?
1966. So I had met some people who worked for Lawrence Rockefeller. And so they hired me, my firm, to handle the resorts in the Caribbean. So I handled Dorado Beach, Caneel Bay, Little Dix Bay, and those Rockefeller resorts in the Caribbean. That's the beginning of my career.
So in some of those years, I'm positive you used to send stories, press releases to my father, who published those for you. And subsequently, all right, over the years, when you were in the PR business, you would send them to me. Your mother wrote a story of one of those places,
Yeah.
and now Chris, right? So
Right.
it really is unique how
It's
that
like a
all-
family.
That's,
It's like a big family.
Right,
You and your brother,
Yeah, I
and me
know.
and my mother,
yes,
and Chris.
that it's so rare for that to happen, all right? And
Yeah.
in your own right, all right, that your family is able to communicate with people, and there's something that is heartfelt with the way you communicate
Right.
with people.
Well, I had this feeling of public service that sort of like came from those years. You say, how did this affect me when I came home? Bob Graham read the story that Chris just read from. It was in the Miami Herald. He read that story, and he called me up. He was a state senator at that point. Nobody ever heard of Bob Graham.
Our former governor and U.S. senator.
Yes. He called me up and he says, I'd like to meet you. And he thought that I had something to do with the Kennedys' family and success. He didn't realize I didn't. I was just a little pipsqueak.
But you were there faster than you could say.
Yeah. So he called me. I went out to Miami Lakes and met him and his brother. Well, that was the beginning of a relationship between me and Bob Graham. So I helped him run for governor and be elected governor. He was governor for 8 years. Then he became a U.S. senator for 16 years. And I helped him, and I was his PR consultant during all these years. I was his sort of like kitchen cabinet guy.
So I have ADD, so when it kicks in, sometimes I got to talk about it. So one of the things I recognized about you intuitively inside, we were involved in some of the same things. Although you were older, I enjoyed those things and those people in particular. And so those days that we were walking over there on that treadmill at probably half a mile an hour, I knew that I could feel it from you, even though I don't think that we had the exact discussions about it. It was something that you emanate as far as you caring and about people. And then you did the things you could to help those people so that what you thought was the right thing to do was there. And so there's a whole couple of generations that are prospering because of the work that you did. I don't know if you're aware of that, but I can tell you that. Because whenever you share that story and it's being told internally for years, you affect the next generation. Like the people that are in the studio here, they'll probably say, what are they talking about? All right. But we know that you've made a huge impact in Miami and throughout the country.
Well, I appreciate that. And I pass it along to Chris and my two daughters.
And we know that. Tell us about your two daughters, your sisters.
Maggie and Katie.
And where do they live?
Katie is Vice President of Programming for Maryland Public Television in Baltimore. And Maggie is number 2 in Alumni Affairs at Ransom Everglades School.
Yeah. Communications.
Yeah.
Right? And connecting people, because that's really what it's about.
Yeah.
And sharing, and as you shared in the book here, you made it so that people look at that and feel that and understand that. We've got 2 minutes left. We're going to do this again, maybe a different format in the back later on. But I want to thank you for your service, all right, to your country and to each one of us in our own particular way. So Chris, so here you are, you're a teenager, you're realizing all these things are going on within your family. So share with us again as an adult how that's impacted you and how you are sharing that with other people.
Well, my father's service inspired me to pursue my own avenues of service. I joined the Army. I became a police officer and a park ranger at one point. And he and I still do pro bono work for nonprofit organizations, and we always will. We just feel that the responsibility to give back to the community, and I learned that from him.
Right. So
Right.
Pop, it worked.
Right.
David Pearson, thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
very
being
much. Thank you
Chris,
for
as-
having us.
As always, thank you so much. And folks, and one more picture. Okay, let's see the one more picture here. Here we go. Coming up. So is this? It's hard for me to see. Is this the right
the
before he was
motorcade.
shot?
Oh, that's the
right as he was
motorcade.
shot.
That's
All right.
seconds before the fatal shot.
All right. So as they're saying, soon after that he was home. I'm going to thank Alex and Michelle and Lorenzo for producing the show. Remember, folks, take care of yourselves. See you later. Bye.